Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Heather Bacher, and I am the state coordinator for the Women for the Land program. We are an initiative of the Indiana Conservation Partnership, and very happy to have you here with us today for this conservation conversation. Our speaker today is Stephanie Fritchie, and she's with Xerces Society. And I'm going to go ahead and ask her to begin sharing her screen. And while she does that, to get our presentation started, I will just share with you that we're going to have this presentation from Stephanie. She'll be sharing some information with us. And today is being recorded, but then we'll also have a chance to ask questions both in the chat, and then later on at the end of the presentation, we can share our videos and unmute ourselves and have more of a discussion as we like. But since we're recording, we'll do the presentation first. And with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie. And Stephanie, you're still muted.
Thank you, Heather. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone from wherever you're joining us today. This is the third in a series of 4 of these types of learning circles that I have organized, thanks to Heather here, to present through Women for the Land. So today we're really focusing on progress, maintenance, and challenges in our work to plant and grow and care for pollinator habitat. We've previously talked about planning and also about community science, getting the word out, or collecting data and contributing that to conservation efforts through community science projects. And today I've got a very short presentation, and like Heather said, we'll open up the chat for you to put in some of your comments or questions, and then have a little bit more presentation, and then at the end we'll open it up for more discussion here. So I am Stephanie Fritchie. I'm an agronomist and native plant materials specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. I am based in West Central Indiana, and my work is in many locations across the United States, North America, Canada, Latin America, and in Europe, working on pollinator habitat, and especially the seeds and plants of native species that are important to include in those habitats. I'd like to just hear a bit from any of you and hear where you're joining from today. What is your interest for participating in today's learning circle, and what do you hope to learn, or how do you hope to grow from that today? So you could please put those points in the chat. And while everyone's sharing those things about themselves, I'll share a bit more about the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. If you've heard of the Audubon Society and are familiar with their work in bird conservation, you can think of the Xerces Society as something similar, but for invertebrates, all those animals that don't have backbones. So this includes all insects, as well as spiders, centipedes, freshwater mussels, other mollusks, et cetera, et cetera. We are a science-based nonprofit conservation organization. Our main office is in Portland, Oregon, and we have regional offices in about 15 different states, and we are currently at around 70 staff throughout the United States. And our name Xerces comes from the beautiful butterfly pictured here, the Xerces blue butterfly, but it's kind of a sad yet hopeful name. The Xerces blue was the first butterfly to go extinct in the United States due to habitat destruction because of human development and building in the San Francisco area. And at the time, about 50 years ago, a group of concerned conservationists organized around this, this butterfly with the goal and the hope of preventing future butterfly extinctions. So in those 50 years of history, since the founding of the Xerces Society, we've now grown to still work on butterfly conservation, but also to encompass overall pollinator and pollinator habitat conservation. We work a lot in agricultural landscapes on enhancing the biodiversity of crops, cover crops, and permanent habitat on farms. Our endangered species team works on specific bumblebees, fireflies, mussels, butterflies, and other groups of imperiled invertebrates. We also have a pesticide management team, which provides invaluable expertise and translation of the latest research on how insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides are present in the environment, either through direct application or contamination, and then how we can try to reduce the use of those pesticides and reduce the harm that they cause to non-target invertebrates. And then we also have an urban conservation team, as well as work in policy and advocacy. Okay, so getting a bit into, I'm going to just check the chat here. Take a quick look here. You know, the nice thing about doing this through Zoom, we can have folks from just about anywhere. So, of course, Indiana, Missouri, Idaho, California, Switzerland, Washington, Michigan, Arizona, Maryland, West Virginia, Argentina, Miami, Florida, Utah, Virginia. Great. All right. And Oregon. Karina. Hi, Karina. So yeah, great to have everyone joining us here and sharing a bit about yourselves there. This is just a slide I'll present as an overview of how to get started here. So when you're planning and then planting your pollinator habitat, of course, we want to try to minimize pesticide risk, either at the actual site or from neighboring locations. As much as possible, connect it to other quality pollinator habitat, promote plant diversity, especially plant species that are native to the local area, and a diversity of flower colors, flower shapes, bloom time, stem and other nesting attributes, the availability of pollen and nectar, as well as different plant families are all good ways to prioritize plant diversity. And then most pollinators get the water they need from the nectar that they drink, but some will need supplemental water or mud for their mineral nutrition or for building nests out of mud material. And then a bit more in the planning part. Again, there are choices to make about your planning of the pollinator habitat in terms of size and what your real conservation goals are for specific pollinators or for generalists. Where is your habitat? What are the aesthetic considerations to take into account? And then, like I said, with plant diversity, also be sure to have a range of resources, food resources, nesting resources for pollinators throughout the season. And then I think like long-term into the future, but I think also it's important to add like long-term pre-planting is site prep and getting the site kind of in better condition in terms of weeds and other management issues before planting, because once you have planted, whether you're planting seeds or transplants or rootstock, once you have the plants you want in place, it can be a lot more challenging to try to manage against the types of plants that you don't want in the habitat. And we've also kind of looked at these three graphics in a previous learning circle to illustrate the concept of sleep, creep, and leap. And this is a generalized way of thinking about what to expect from native perennial species, especially when sown from a seed mix. The first year after planting, it may not look like a lot is happening above ground, but because these are perennials, these plants, they'll germinate and be a small seedling, but there's a lot that they're building and growing underground in their rhizomes and root systems, because this again is what will help them get through the difficult season, which is usually winter, and especially hot, arid, or Mediterranean climates. The difficult season is summer, but the first year, the expectation is they're not really sleeping, but in terms of what we see, it may look like there's not a lot going on. And then creep is in that second year where there's a bit more activity or growth that's observable above ground. Often this is vegetation, and plants are not, it's green leafy matter. Plants are not yet into producing flowers. But then that third year, they've built both enough underground and enough of their leaf biomass, and they really get into flowering. And that's the leap concept, where we really see a lot of their growth and presence and showiness because they're flowering. So let's see, yeah, I'm just going to check our time here, but at this point, we'll go back to the chat and just have any of you share where you're at with your own pollinator habitat planting in terms of progress, maintenance, or any challenges. If you want to share what you have planted already and any successes or challenges, whether you're just sharing those as statements or if you have questions, please go ahead and add those to the chat. And I'll also just address that yesterday or the evening before, Heather sent out an email to everyone who had registered for this webinar to say you could share photos or share some questions ahead of time. We got a few that were specifically asking about the problem when moles are eating a lot of the plant roots that have been planted. And then similar but different was a question about lizards that are eating a lot of the pollinator plants. And those are, significant problems, and I understand the frustration around that. Unfortunately, it's just not my area of expertise to be able to address that. I mean, in an ideal world, right, there'd be enough food to go around for everybody. Plants do all kinds of amazing things, and one of the amazing things plants do is they feed many other kinds of wildlife, from pollinators to animals like lizards and moles. But I know if you've got just a small area or a few really treasured plants that you're trying to care for, that kind of feeding can be frustrating too. So I'm sorry I can't offer any advice on those, but I would suggest checking with some of your local county resources like Extension or the Soil and Water or Resource Conservation Districts, depending on where you're at. Let's see, we've got some folks here in the chat has shared, converting my lawn to native plantings. I'm on year 4 and I've learned a lot along the way. One thing is using sheet mulching instead of landscaping fabric because it decomposes more easily. And then this person expands the beds and adds a little bit more plant plugs each spring and fall. Yeah, that's great. I use sheet mulching myself. So just as a quick overview, sheet mulching is the use of organic materials. So it could be corrugated cardboard, stacks of newspapers, wheat straw. If you're in a yard or place with a lot of leaf litter from trees, you can use that, or just layers of these things. I tend to use wheat straw. I buy straw bales and then kind of let them split apart in those different flakes. And then I'll set up flakes over the turf area or garden area that I want to expand or enrich. And I put that on there for many, many months and let that suppress the weeds or the turf. And then I may just, use my fingers to kind of separate back and pull a little opening in that straw and put the plant plug in there. Then I leave all that straw in place. And it's also, organic in the sense of being naturally derived. So it's decomposing, it's feeding more of the microbes in the soil and the smaller decomposers as well. So yeah, I like to use and also recommend that sheet mulching method. So thanks for sharing that. We've got someone else who's replaced their entire front lawn with native pollinator plants. That's amazing and wonderful to hear. And the maintenance there is mostly weeding out showy goldenrod, which is Solidago speciosa. So this is a great pollinator plant. Most of the goldenrods bloom mid to late summer and into fall. So they're a really wonderful nectar and pollen source, both for butterflies and for bees as they're going into overwintering or migration, in the case of monarchs, for example. But looks like this one's being rather prolific and kind of spreading its seed throughout the area, and getting a little more abundant, tall, or aggressive than she would have liked. So a different goldenrod species. I'm not sure, Megan, where you're located. This is a kind of Midwestern or Eastern species. And yeah, depending on your climate and soil, a species might be a bit more aggressive than you'd like for a small space like a garden. Or if you have a larger space, a species like that can be good to help fill in over time. So there's Canada goldenrod, Solidago canadensis, or tall goldenrod, Solidago altissima. Those are the two in the eastern US that tend to be the most aggressive. They really spread by rhizomes. So at least species like showy goldenrod tends to be more clump forming, but then yeah, if you have all these seeds going back, you can get additional new plants there. If you are having a problem with kind of a plant self-sowing or self-seeding too much, then one recommendation is let it flower completely so that the pollen and nectar are there for the insects you're hoping to provide that food resource for, but then clip those off before the seeds mature and just bag those or put them in your compost area. Next, so this person's sharing a habitat challenge. They're working with a large area of formal gravel mine with the topsoil stripped away. There's sandy scrubland at the moment, about 6 acres in Southwest Michigan, and lots of spotted knapweed, which is an invasive species in that area. Germination from seed spreading does not seem to work particularly well, and transplants are often eaten by deer and rabbits. Yes, for sure. When you're working in a post-mining habitat, regardless of where in the world you are, you're dealing with a very altered system there. Like you say, the topsoil has been stripped away. In some cases, other fill has been put in to replace it, but it's not the same. In many cases, you're left with subsoil or really rocky soil. So just kind of choosing which species to work with is, you'd often follow a different path. If you were in an area that was normally forested, right next to a mine, for example, but then the mine site itself, you may look at, instead of trying to reforest that because you don't have the same soils anymore, you might look at species that would normally grow on cliffs or rocky outcrops in the area, and choose species accordingly. There's certainly lots of groups all around the world that are working on post-mine restoration and revegetation. And there's so much more work required in terms of replacing some kind of substrate, sometimes dealing with heavier toxic minerals, and the general lack of appropriate soil there as well. So I think, I think it makes sense, unfortunately, of why seed germination is not working so well, because it's such a altered and difficult type of habitat. If you can, work with the transplants, the species that you see that are especially susceptible to being eaten by deer and rabbits, in as much as you have the capacity to do this, caging them for a few years would be helpful. And other species that might work well at the site can be used that would be less susceptible to deer and rabbits that could go uncaged. So yeah, I hope that helps a bit. A 20 by 15 area that's been sowed 2 years ago. It looks good this year, but now this person would like to plant half an acre area with native seed using the cardboard and mulching instead of spraying. Will the seeds germinate? Yeah, so that sheet mulching, like I mentioned, cardboard or other like natural biodegradable kinds of mulch works well if you have a relatively small area, but getting up to something half an acre in size, again, if you've got readily available materials like cardboard and leaves, you can do that on that size. Will the seeds germinate? Yeah, so sheet mulching is better suited for transplanting, because if you're using a seed mix, but you've done sheet mulching, you'll be sprinkling or sowing the seeds on top of that sheet mulching, and they just won't have enough contact. They need to be in contact with the actual soil. They won't get enough moisture for a sustained enough period if they're on top of the mulch. And then, the flip side is you also can't plant the seeds onto the soil and then put the mulch on top, because the mulch will work to suppress any of those germinating seeds from growing as well. So it would be a lot of work also, but you could use the sheet mulching method as a site preparation. And if you have enough time, you can leave it in place for several years and let it break down enough that then you could put your seed mix on top. But otherwise, yeah, I think it could be it's often not the right combination to use sheet mulching with seed sowing. It's a better match for using transplants with. And then depending on the weed pressure, yes, you can use judicious choices of herbicide to do some site preparation, but also you can use mowing or other methods if you have lower weed pressure. Let's see, eliminated lawn grass when I moved to Lucerne 10 years ago, and I'm a member of a program that distributes 2 species of mason bees. And I also have a good assortment of ground nesting native bees and bumblebees. Wonderful. There's a fresh water source, don't use any chemicals in the garden, and also encourages their neighbors to provide fresh water and not use any chemicals. This person is an urban forester and works to encourage everyone to have a window box or plants on their balcony and to include a fresh water supply. That's great. That's great, like to hear about your conversion from lawn grass to all kinds of other plants for pollinators and providing water, and that outreach part, right? Talking to neighbors and spreading the word there. Yep. So Heather shared kind of her experience with sheet mulching, black and white newspaper. Again, some of the colored ones with ink can be a concern for certain contaminants, cardboard, and then adding more mulch, leaves, and soil. Yep. I'm going to just do a few more here. A large section of sage, lavender, and rosemary in an area that's in a long-term drought crisis, so being water-wise. In terms of plant choices and irrigation, but looking to keep converting my lawn into a year-round pollinator heaven. That's from Anne. And I'm not sure if you're in maybe a Mediterranean habitat, if you're in one of the persons who said they were from California. But there are several great plant lists that focus on native plants for pollinators that are water-wise. Again, matching the plants to your location and climate is the best way to use the resources that nature provides. A lot of the native plants will be adapted to the climate of an area and have appropriate water requirements. Okay. Yeah. And just stop mowing or reducing your mowing. You can get some of those other short statured or quickly flowering plants in your lawn. This is again, I think from Europe, but Primulas ajuga, which would be an invasive species in many yards in the United States. Ranunculus, which are the buttercups, Fragaria are wild strawberries, and then Lysimachia. In North America, we have things like violets that are native, other non-native plants that are good pollinator resources in yards can also be dandelions, a few things in the mint family, and another one that's native and in the mint family is self-heal or Prunella vulgaris. That's actually native in North America and Europe. So, and Anne said, yeah, she's in the Central Valley. Okay. Then what herbicide is the least toxic to insects and wildlife? I think that's a bit more nuanced and complicated question than I'll answer on here, because it also just depends if you're looking at terrestrial insects and wildlife versus aquatic ones. But the University of California, Davis has a great kind of pesticide and be safe database that I'll put that in the chat here at the end of the webinar. So, okay, thanks everyone for that. I'm gonna move back to the presentation here. And I wanna talk about a Xerces publication that is the Habitat Assessment Guide for Pollinators in Yards, Gardens, and Parks. And I'm gonna have you all follow along. So I'm just gonna stop sharing for a minute. And switch over. So Xerces, one of the things that we offer is a huge library of free online PDFs and similar publications that you can view online or download. And this Habitat Assessment Guide is one of those. So I'm going to share a view of this on my screen, but then you can follow along using that link that I put in the chat there. Heather, can you just confirm that you can see what I'm sharing here?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right. And maybe make it a little bit bigger. So this Habitat Assessment Guide, as you can see, is focused on yards, gardens, and parks. Xerces also has these for agricultural areas and some specific to monarchs. So you can just do a web search for Habitat Assessment Guide in Xerces to see all of those. But this is a fairly concise, it's just 12 pages, as you can see. And you're basically walking through 4 main attribute categories of your yard or garden and scoring each of those. And then you do this at one point in time, and walking through that I think is really helpful to guide you as far as what to look for and think about. And then you can incorporate some of those changes, and then a few years later go back and score yourself again and see how the actions you've taken have changed your score. You know, this is showing us a neighborhood view of various different yards and kind of all the components that help contribute to pollinator habitat, from fruit trees to certain plants in vegetable gardens, flowering shrubs. There can be flowers that or plants that are from forests or tolerant of shade that provide pollinator habitat. Also, the sun-loving grassland or prairie plants can be in more open areas. Medians or other kind of built environment areas can provide pollinator habitat when planted with appropriate species. Like we were just talking about, you can make a bee lawn where it's low growing and mowed sometimes, but there are plants that are more than just turf grass that grow there. Rain gardens or stormwater management areas can be planted with types of plants that provide pollinator resources. And then, yeah, kind of like the medians, other areas alongside curbs and sidewalks can be planted with that, with pollinator friendly plants. Page 4 is kind of the quick and easy, just a checklist of actions that you can go through and check yourself on, or like look at these as opportunities to increase the value of the area for pollinator habitat. But what I wanted to spend the time on here in the next 5 minutes or so is to just go through how this works. So this is the summary, is actually the first part of the assessment, and the total score goes here. In the lower right there, you'll have a score for section 1 about foraging habitat, a total score for section 2, which focuses on the nesting value of the habitat. Section 3 is pesticide practices, and then section 4 are community action steps. So this is where you'll come back to and plug in all of your totals. So if we look at section 1, the foraging habitat, this is in several sub items here. So item 1A is just looking at the percentage and area of your site that's composed of flowering vegetation. And you kind of just break your area down into tenths. So you have 10%, 20%, 30%. You can give yourself 1 point for each 10% that you have in flowering vegetation. And there's some nice photos there to show what different percents would look like roughly. Then of that flowering vegetation, you kind of do the same thing, but you just focus on the total percent that is native flowering plant species. And give yourself a point for each 10% of that. Then the different kinds of foraging features. So like I just showed at that neighborhood scale photo, if you have a prairie patch, but you also have some shaded areas with pollinator friendly plants in them, but you also have vegetables or herbs, et cetera, for each of those different plant types or foraging features, you can add some points to your score for that. And there's some photos to help illustrate that as well. And I like this picture in the bottom right because it shows a lot of plants in containers. It's just along a footpath, so there's not a lot of space here, but you can see how it's really been maximized to cram in a lot of different species in that space with different berries and herbs that can also have pollinator value. Then we look at scoring for the seasonality. Like how many species do you have blooming and providing resources in the spring and in the summer and in the fall? Or if you're in a Mediterranean climate, you might flip this and summer would be your dormant season instead of winter. And there might be species you would want to have flowering in winter when it's cooler and there's more moisture. But anyway, three seasons and how many species you have blooming during that time. Yeah, and the example here then just shows again a yard that went through turf conversion and then a variety of species that are blooming there throughout the year. Then there's this concept of superfoods, and also plants for specialist bees and plants that are host plants for different butterfly and moth caterpillars. So there's a plant list later on in this guide, and you can use those icons, the star for superfoods, the bee icon for specialist bees, and the caterpillar icon for host plants to help you identify which species you have in those categories and give yourself a score. So then you add up, the A, B, C, D, and E, and go back up to that upper section and enter your total in for the foraging habitat. Section 2 looks at nesting and overwintering. So here I'll just mention that in contrast to honeybees, which are native from Europe, and they're really a domesticated or managed species. They have a very different biology from much of our North American native bees. Honeybees are a social insect. They have different castes. They're storing honey to get through the winter. Whereas the nearly 3,600 native bee species in North America, they have a different life cycle. Many of them, roughly 70%, nest in the ground, and about 30% nest in cavities that are in like dead trees or branches or plant stems. And they're really single mothers kind of raising their young individually. So having places like unvegetated area with open but undisturbed soil is critical for the nesting and the reproductive phase of these ground nesting bees. And then a lot of them will overwinter in the leaf litter that's underneath native bunch grasses or other tree leaf litter on the site. So this section shows some examples of what that looks like, both close up and at a site, and how to score that for ground nesting bees. And then for those cavity nesting bees, looking at things like leaving last year's stems with their hollow centers in place, or leaving some standing dead tree trunks or brush piles, other dead logs or branches, even rock piles or rock walls. Those provide cavities where these tunnel nesting bees or bumblebees, which nest in cavities or in leaf litter, can find a space to nest. Section 3 is a bit more concise here, looking at pesticide practices, and here you get points for essentially, what you don't do. And this is a bit more all or nothing, or maybe there is some pesticide use, but it's part of an integrated pest and pollinator management program that's more holistic and preventative, or looks at thresholds before treating rather than just kind of treating everything no matter what. Or, there may be pesticides, often herbicides, used to manage invasive species that is important to do to maintain the overall biodiversity and habitat value there. So that's section 3 for pesticide practices. And then the final section is community action, which we've also talked about and heard examples of how this is important, like just putting a sign in your yard, working to create a neighborhood garden, talking with your neighbors, other community groups, working with local officials on vegetation ordinances, or considering to work towards becoming a bee city USA or a bee campus USA. And then, like we said, at the last month's event, we really focused on community science efforts as well. So anyway, yeah, that's just kind of a walkthrough of those different sections, and pardon me while I scroll back up there, but then, you add the total here for each section, get your overall score. And then, inspired by what you've learned in going through this, you can work towards increasing your score and then go back and score yourself again a few years or months later. The final 2 pages are all these reference materials and resources. on here. And then the last page is this recommended plant list with the different icons there. These are just given at the genus level because we did this at such a zoomed out view, you know, in terms of regions and things. So working with your native plant society or using some of the other Xerces resources or talking with your native plant nursery and supplier, you can help to zone in on which specific species from those genera would be appropriate for your area. And then also this table 2 lists some plants that are more food or herbs or berries that may or may not be native, but something where you can get kind of multiple benefit from in the small space of a yard.